Hello and welcome to a new episode of Zomcast number 7. This week we will talk about the latest developments in the software industry and software technologies, and after that we will talk about Python, how to learn Python. I'm sure that many of you will like the topic and are interested in discussions about this programming language, which is very popular nowadays. Alright, first, let's talk about some news that we had over the last week. Number 1, KubeCon Plus Cloud Native Con North America 2020 virtual schedule available now on November 17. So you can head over to redhat.com to see the full schedule and its date, which, as I mentioned, is November 17. And you can find the details about this big event on that website. The second one is Envoy Proxy released for Windows. I'm not sure what this technology really does, Envoy Proxy, but as the name suggests, it's kind of a proxy that is used on Windows, and it is now released for Windows. Probably it's cross-platform piece of software that was available for Linux and Mac, and now it is available for Windows as well. And we have the article of the week, which is Rootless Containers with Podman. Podman, which is an alias or a similar tool to Docker CLI that you can use to create, manage, and run containers. It is created by the Containers Foundation, and you can manage containers with it. This article is about managing containers in a rootless manner. This means that you don't have to be the root user, as is the case with Docker, to run containers and manage containers. So in this article, which is written by Prakar Sethi from Red Hat, you can find a lot of information on how to get started with Podman if you don't already have any experience with this tool, and you can have better insight into the tools that are not platform specific, and this way you can get familiar with a tool that is based and created based upon Open Container Initiative, let's say, standards. And also the last one is a comparison between MariaDB versus MySQL. I'm sure that many of you will like this comparison. What is really the difference between these two database systems? MariaDB, as some of you might know, is a project that was branched off or forked from MySQL project, and it's an open source software for managing relational databases. It's a relational database system, and it's in many ways is similar to MySQL, but it has some distinct features. So there's a very good webinar if you are interested to know the exact details and the exact differences between these two database technologies. You can head over to mariadb.com/resources and go to the webinar that has this title, MySQL vs MariaDB, or vice versa, MariaDB versus MySQL. But now let's talk about today's topic, which is how to learn Python. Interestingly, I recently started doing a project with Python. I was given a project to do. I was assigned a project that deals with some data and data processing, a lot of string processing. So I decided to use Python because there are a lot of good libraries for it. And I find this language very easy to get started with. At least that was the case. That was what I was thinking when I decided to use it for my project. But along the way, also I had some challenges because Python is not in all ways exactly the same as other object-oriented programming languages or scripting languages like PHP. So if you want to do really a project with Python, you need to go a little bit deeper into the project and into the language syntax. So honestly, it was my first experience doing a project completely with Python. So I'm gonna share with you my experience. I hope that you will find it useful. So I think that it's better to start off with the documentation page of python.org, which has a lot of good resources in order to get started with Python, as well as find some resources like references to the language and also the standard library. So let me share with you my screen. My browser screen. You will find some useful information here. We are going to go over the items that I have found very useful. So here's python.org, and as you can see, we see a section for documentation. And by the way, Python has a couple of versions. It is not only Python 1 or 2 or 3. You know, the latest version of this language, this programming language, is 3.8.5, I guess. I'm not exactly sure the specific minor version of the language, but the major language version is 3, and a lot of software packages nowadays drop support for Python 2. So you should find, if you are going to do a serious programming project with Python, you better stick with Python 3 and avoid using Python 2. And Python 3, by the way, has also deprecated a lot of the features of Python version 2. So we are going to check out the documentation for Python 3. If you hover your mouse over documentation section, you will see that there's docs, and I select it, and here there's a section for Python 3.x resources. This is where you need to go to get started with Python, and we have a section tutorial. I highly recommend that you start with here and not go over library reference or language reference in the beginning, because you need to, as the documentation suggests, whet your appetite first and not exhaust yourself. So I open the tutorial page. I show you that. Here's a very, very good introduction to the language. Probably it's gonna take you a lot of time, maybe a couple of days, to go over all of the items that are included in this document, but it's very useful, and I recommend that you make sure that you review these parts, like the whetting your appetite. This gives you an overview of the language and tests some of your language background. Also, the type section, numerals, string lists, I highly suggest that you go over and read them. We have control flows, control flow tools like if statement, for statement, range function, and others. These are highly recommended for first-time users of the language. Sets and dictionaries, these are kind of specific to this programming language, so you better know how to use them. And modules are very important. Modules and packages like Java, but not exactly like Java, there's the concept of modules and packages that you need to know and how to import them, because in Python often you package your software, your code into some modules, some files that you call them modules, and then make them available to yourself and others by sharing the code. And it's very important to have an understanding of how modules work. And believe me, it's not very difficult. It's easy to understand, especially if you have a background in Java or C++. And mostly Java, of course. And after that, so you see that this is the tutorial page. It's not very difficult. It's written in a kind of a simple language, but not too simple language. But it's better than nothing. And I appreciate the Python project for providing us with that resource. And after that, we have the library reference. This is very important, library reference. This refers to the standard. This refers to the standard library of the language. This, as with C++ language, there's a standard library for Python for a lot of use cases of the language, and it can meet a lot of the needs that you might have for writing projects with this language. So, for example, we have built-in types that are included inside this Python standard library. And I'm not very professional in Python, by the way. I just recently came over these different sections and I found them useful. And strings, these are very useful. Like string processing, regular expression, very useful. These are very important for you to review and read, especially if your project involves processing text and large amount of text. And some other data types that are also included in the standard library of the Python programming language, like datetime, zone info. For example, I open calendar. I haven't used it in my projects. As you can see, it is included in this path, lib/calendar.py, which is a module specifically for this built-in type. So, this is very useful in addition to the tutorial section that I showed you already. And also, if you are a little bit more comfortable with the language, once you are a little bit more comfortable with the language and you feel that you know enough of the language, there's also the language reference, which you can refer to in order to find solutions and find answers to some of the questions that you might have about the subtleties of the language and some complicated questions that you might have, some comparisons that you might have with other language and others. So let me talk a little bit about my project. My project was designing a system that needs to be as fast as possible. So first of all, I used the MariaDB extension or MariaDB module for Python. And in order to make it fast, I came up with the concept. Actually, I didn't come up with. I found the concept of connection pools that MariaDB database provides, and with that, that is available in this module, this MariaDB module. Let me search it for you, MariaDB Python. If you need to use database, this is one way to go. Here's MariaDB connector /Python. You open it and you will find that it has the necessary preliminaries and preparation for getting started. It tells you how to import it, how to install it, how to create a connection, and if you need your application to be as performant as possible, you can use the concept of connection pools. So what I did, I created a class that acts as my data providing class, like my database backend. And it has a single object that acts as a pool. It is the same for the whole application of mine. And if you want to access the database and do some read or write, you get a connection from that pool. And after you're done with that connection, with that operation, you simply close that connection. And in this case, closing the connection doesn't mean that you kill the connection. You don't exactly close the connection. You return the connection to the pool. This kind of increases the performance by allowing to reuse that connection pool that you have already created by connecting to the database. So there's a section for connection pools. It's very useful here on the mariadb.com documentation page. Connection pools, also the transactions. Yes, connection pooling. There's a lot of good information here, how to create a pool and how to get connections from it. And another thing, because I had a lot of read and write and real-time read and write, and it's very important for my application. It's very critical to know the latest changes in the application, because several parts of the app needs to interact with each other, and this interaction, I don't want it to be overcomplicated as my first Python project. So what I did, I used the Redis project, and fortunately there's a Redis Python, as you can see, Redis Python module that you can use for your project. And what Redis does, if you don't know, Redis is an in-memory database. So unlike MariaDB, which saves its data onto the disk, with the Redis database, the data that you have are saved into memory, and therefore it's very easy to read and write them. It's very simple and very, not very simple, not that simple, but very, very fast, because everything is saved in RAM, and RAM is very fast in comparison with disk, even SSD disks. So I think that I have covered a lot, maybe not a lot, but enough for this session. I hope that you find it useful. It was some of my experience with Python, and certainly I will have a lot to explore with Python, and maybe I will dedicate another session for our discussion about Python and maybe some other aspects of my experience, my future experiences with this programming language. So thank you again for following me, for liking and commenting, and for listening to this podcast. Please, if you liked the podcast, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel, and suggest any questions or any topics that you like to be discussed in this podcast. I hope that you liked this podcast, and take care and live safe.